when I was asked to give a presentation on the economics of oil and gas, I felt quite overwhelmed because there is an enormous economics literature out there. Economists have studied oil and gas sectors almost to death. There are papers upon papers, views upon views, recommendations upon recommendations. But how on earth am I going to summarize all this information? And then, of course, I was told, well, I had 15 minutes to make my presentation. So I could say an awful lot about the economics of oil and gas, but you'll be very relieved to hear that I'm not going to do so. Instead, I'm going to summarize what I think are the economic challenges for Namibia in better managing this, what on the face of it is a huge blessing, and make essentially 10 short points about the challenges that policymakers will have to address if we're going to get this right. Before I do so, though, I'm just going to make a few remarks about myself, if that's okay, because a lot of people here won't know me, and I think it's important that I make clear why I'm here on stage today. So, I've worn many hats in the past, as many of you will know, many of my Namibian friends and colleagues will know. I came to Namibia in 1991. You can tell from my accent I'm originally from the UK. I've worked in government here, in the private sector, in the NGO sector, in the research community. I've looked at the economic problems from all around, but I consider myself at the moment an independent freelance economist, and today I'm speaking very much with an IPPR hat on. The Institute of Public Policy Research is a Windhoek-based charity which does public policy research. I do a lot of work for it. I was a founding director in the year 2000, and I'm also the author of this heavy tome called A Guide to the Namibian Economy. So I don't just want to plug my book, although I'm happy to do so, but I want to try and reassure you that the comments I make today are based on 30 years worth of research and a quite close following of economic development here in Namibia since independence. So I'm not just pulling numbers and thoughts out of thin air. It's based on a whole range of papers that I've produced over the years. Sorry, let me just go back. I think the other thing it shows, especially to the foreign guests here, is how things happen in Namibia. I've been invited to speak to you today as a genuinely independent voice, and I think that says something about the country we live in. Independent voices like mine, like those of the IPPR, are actually welcomed and brought into the debate. And I think that says something about the country. I've written many critical pieces about government and government policy over the years, about other things as well. And yet I'm still invited to participate in important venues like this. I'm still welcomed. And I think that really says something about Namibia and the sort of culture of discussion that we've created here over the 30 years since independence. My presentation will not be focused on the engineering challenges which have already been mentioned, which are significant. I don't want to downplay that at all, but I'm going to focus more on the broad economic issues that I think all of us, on the government side, certainly on the side of public policy makers, but also on the industry side and on the general society side of the three-way conversation that we're having, would be interested in and should be aware of. I'm going to pose key questions. I'm not pretending I've got all the answers, but I think I've got a pretty good idea of what I think the challenges are for Namibia, if we're going to get this right. So I'm going to be posing key questions. Maybe some of you will have those key answers. What I'm going to say is based largely, but not only, on a paper I produced back in 2002. So I produced something called the Quarterly Economic Review, which is available free of charge to be downloaded from the IPPR website. I produced this in the second quarter of 2022 on African oil and gas experiences. I subtitled it, Forewarned is Forearmed. And I looked at the experiences of 7 African countries and their experiences of managing their oil and gas well. I encourage you to read that paper. It's not a long paper, but it summarizes many important issues. Okay, so finally, you know, to the person in the street, maybe this is a blessing. I know Denver's already talking about having more children. We're all talking about retiring at 50 already. Expectations are very high. But I'm afraid from the economic point of view, we say, whoa, people, just hang on a minute. Because this supposed blessing has to be managed properly if it's going to give us all the things we want from it, if it's going to meet the expectations that people have of it. It could have very damaging implications for the economy if the resource isn't handled properly. And I think already that's come through in many of the presentations this morning, right from the Prime Minister to the Minister and further down to senior officials in the Ministry of Mines and Energy. So I think those messages are already sinking through quite deeply, and I find that very encouraging. So, what are the economic challenges? And I'd say, although these are mainly challenges for economic policymakers here, they are also of interest to everyone involved in oil and gas, and indeed everyone who has a stake in the economic development of this country. So I've highlighted 10, and I think this gives us a good framework to think about things as we go forward throughout the conference over the next couple of days. The first is, as already been mentioned, the question of the energy transition. The world is transitioning to net zero by 2050, hopefully keeping global temperature rises below 1.5 degrees. That already looks a little bit ambitious. But this process is happening, and Namibia is trying to create a new industry for Namibia in the midst of that process, which I think presents additional challenges. It's not 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000. It's 2023 to 2020. So we're developing an industry against certain headwinds. Things will get more difficult for new fossil fuel projects, from financing to environmental standards to a whole range of other things. So I think we have to recognize that in what we're doing. And I think in a way that puts a bit of a, if you like, a stopwatch on what we're doing. There's a bit of a time pressure because the door is slowly and steadily starting to close. And we're trying to develop this new industry here in the midst of that closing door. So my first challenge is this, the energy transition. How does Namibia fast-track the development of the oil industry so go as fast as possible to maximize the benefits from the resource we have, while the door closes on new fossil fuel projects, and we also maximize the benefits to the country? The longer we take haggling over things, local content, local employment, onshore refineries, and all these other things, tax regimes and things, the longer we take haggling over all this, the more the door has closed on the new projects. So we're under slight pressure of time. The second point is that of oil revenues. Perhaps the major benefit to Namibia will come through the oil revenues we get, the tax revenues that government gets from the oil resource. Employment, yes, there will be other benefits, of course, but this will be the real significant benefit to Namibia. We've looked at the tax regime earlier this morning. I myself have done a few calculations about the government take versus the private sector's take. But I think generally Namibians have to be convinced that this tax regime that we're operating under gives a fair share of revenues to governments, in other words, Namibia, and a fair share to those private sector players who are investing billions in developing this new industry. Now the term fair is a difficult one. It's not one economists tend to use, but it's out there. And I think that license, that social license to operate, will very much be influenced by people's perceptions of whether this tax regime is in fact fair. So we all have an interest in understanding the tax regime. I sense that the understanding isn't quite there yet. Certainly my understanding isn't there yet. So second one is oil revenues. Perhaps the main benefit to the country is tax revenue. Does Namibia's petroleum taxation regime provide government with sufficient revenue and the investors with sufficient return across the price cycle? The price of oil goes up and down all the time. And we're looking across the cycle. You can't just pick and choose which part of the cycle you're looking at. So second major areas of interest. The third area of economic interest and challenge, I'd say, is that of regulation. As we've seen this morning, the government of Namibia is an active shareholder in these oil and gas developments. It has at least a 10% stake. And I'm not commenting on whether that is a good and bad thing, but certainly it's a shareholder wanting to maximize its return as a shareholder, as all shareholders do. At the same time, government is the regulator of the industry. And of course, when you're the referee and you're the player, naturally there's a bit of a conflict of interest. And how do you balance that? So I would say the third point is this conflict of interest and regulatory, what the economists call regulatory capture. How does government balance the interest of being both regulator and owner, and balance that in the interest of the country as a whole? Fourth, the wider economic benefits. You can imagine a situation where these oil and gas fields, 250 kilometers offshore, essentially a little island economy, the oil is pumped out, put on tankers, and taken to world market. It hardly affects what's happening in Namibia. Obviously, there's a little bit of backward linkages, but not much. You could imagine that situation. That's sort of quick and dirty. Let's get this off the ground as quickly as we can. But that's not what Namibia wants, of course. Namibia wants to maximize the total economic benefits from this resource. So the challenge is, how do we do that? And that's through, of course, local content, which has been mentioned, governments developing this policy, and employment of Namibians. Absolutely right. But a huge economic challenge, especially as this isn't a country which has a history of oil and gas, so we're starting from scratch almost. Fifth, taking that a step further, we've heard it this morning already, can we push those domestic benefits even further by, for example, establishing significant onshore storage and even refining capacity? So I think that's the next real challenge. Can we do that? Does it make economic sense? What are the costs? What are the benefits? Should Namibia seek to add value through onshore storage and refining, and possibly other industries? Chemical industries have been mentioned this morning in some of the presentations. So those are my first 5 key challenges. The next one, well, we've heard about how much money is likely to flow from this, and I've mentioned the tax regime. The Namibian exchequer, the fiscus, is likely to receive an awful lot of revenue from this resource over the lifespan of the resource. Now, we're always complaining about having too little money to spend in this country, something with which I actually disagree. But ironically enough, spending an awful lot of money well is even more a challenge to many governments across the world. And I'm not just talking about developing countries. When you have an awful lot of money, the pressure to really prioritize and spend on things that really produce a return is actually much reduced. So the challenge really is what to do with all this money, and there are all sorts of things we could do with it. We created this sovereign wealth fund. I think that's a great first step. But do we put the money into the sovereign wealth fund for the rainy day of future generations? Do we do that? Do we spend it now, or do we save it for the future? Do we, 1 minute left, oh my goodness. Do we spend it on infrastructure? Do we spend it to expand the public sector? We've got a whole range of things we could possibly spend the money on. What is the best way of spending it for the benefit of the country long term? And I have to say, our track record there hasn't been great. I've followed the economy very closely over the last 30 years, as those of you who've read my book will acknowledge. But we've always spent everything we've got. We've had windfalls from SACU, from diamonds, from other industries, and we've spent it all. And we're now at a debt to GDP ratio of 70%, which is incredibly high. So we have no track record of really saving revenues from windfalls. So the question is, can we do that with the oil revenues? So public expenditure. The next point is the currency. Now, we've heard the issue of Dutch disease this morning, and I think the classic mechanism through which that works is when you have a floating currency of your own, and you suddenly hit on oil and gas, you get all this revenue, your currency tends to appreciate. Foreigners want your local currency now, and they're exchanging US dollars, hard currencies, for your local currency, and that has the tendency to push up the value of your currency. Now that might sound good to politicians and to importers, but it's actually potentially extremely damaging for exporters. And what often happens in oil-dependent economies is that this rise in the exchange rate then has a dampening effect on the rest of the economy. So all those other export sectors are damaged. So I think we need to look at our currency arrangements. We have a peg, more than a peg to South Africa at the moment. Will that still be appropriate? Do we need another peg? I think these are huge issues that the central bank will have to look at. So what currency arrangement will help minimize the potential damage of undue currency appreciation and Dutch disease? Okay, but the currency isn't the only mechanism through which these oil revenues can cause damage to an economy. You can imagine, for example, that all this revenue comes into government coffers and government decides to double the size of the public sector, give all public servants a 100% pay rise. Good for the public servants. But what does that mean for the wider economy? That then sucks in all the most talented people from the economy into the public sector. Is that where you want to have these talented people? You're creating essentially an oil economy which supports a huge public sector. That's just one example of a mechanism. You can think of other mechanisms as well. The market for skilled labour, the market for housing in Namibia. This massive oil find could have huge inflationary effects on all these markets. So we need to look at that. And we need to protect the non-oil export sectors. We already have a reasonably diversified series of exports, merchandise exports. We don't want to destroy that through what we're creating in oil and gas. Ninth point, I would say, is we're going to have to deal with the issue of OPEC and OPEC plus membership. Does it work in our favour to belong to an international organisation where we're then under obligation to manage our production in conjunction with other oil producers? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Obviously, you're entering the realm of geopolitics there, which I don't want to talk about, but there's also an economic aspect to that. Does that serve our interests as a country to belong to these organisations or not? We need a clear view on that. So OPEC and OPEC plus. And then finally, I'd say, and the Minister mentioned this, I think to his great credit, good governance. Good governance to me is what makes the difference between well-managed oil resources and poorly managed oil resources. You can't put enough emphasis on good governance. Now we can discuss what that good governance is. I think all the noises I've heard this morning suggest that we're on the right track, but as they say, talk is cheap. Actions that count louder than words. And I have to say, our track record on other industries, we have fishing industries producing rents, we have diamond industries producing rents. Our track record isn't great in terms of management and openness and transparency. So I think, again, the final challenge, number 10, is governance. And does it make sense to join something like the EITI to project our good governance credentials to the rest of the world and to discipline ourselves to make sure we do the right thing? Master of problems, that's it. 10 clear points. Did I stick to my time?